Hello and welcome to Classical Titerature, the show where birds have made a nest outside my window, and I don't know what I'm going to do about it. So, last time we checked in with the Utopians, Thomas More had provided us with the justification of why he was writing this text. This time, we will begin to discover the traditions and culture of the Utopians. Book 2. The island of the Utopians is 200 miles across in the middle part, where it is widest, and is nowhere more narrower than this except towards the two ends. These ends, drawn toward one another, as if in a 500-mile circle, make the island crescent-shaped, like a new moon. Between the horns of the crescent, which are about 11 miles apart, the sea enters and spreads into a broad bay. Being sheltered from the wind by the surrounding land, the bay is never rough, but quiet and smooth instead, like a big lake. Thus the whole inner coast is one great harbor, across which ships pass in every direction, to the great advantage of the people. What with shallows on one side and rocks on the other, the entrance into the bay is perilous. Near the middle of the channel, there is one rock that rises above the water, and so presents no danger in itself. On top of it, a tower has been built, and there a garrison is kept. Since the other rocks lie under water, they are very dangerous to navigation. The channels are known only to the Utopians, so hardly any strangers enter the bay without one of their pilots, and even they themselves could not enter safely if they did not direct themselves by some landmarks on the coast. If these landmarks were shifted about, the Utopians could lure to destruction an enemy fleet coming against them, however big it was. On the outer side of the island, there are likewise occasional harbors, but the coast is rugged by nature and so well fortified that a few defenders could beat off the attack of a strong force. They say, and the appearance of the place confirms this, that their land was not always an island. But Utopus, who conquered the country and gave it his name, it had previously been called Abraxas, and who brought its rude and uncouth inhabitants to such a high level of culture and humanity that they now excel in that regard. Almost every other people also changed its geography. After winning the victory at his first landing, he cut a channel 15 miles wide where their land joined the continent, and caused the sea to flow around the country. He put not only the natives to work at this task, but all his own soldiers too, so that the vanquished would not think the labor a disgrace. With the work divided among so many hands, the project was finished quickly, and the neighboring peoples, who at first had laughed at his folly, were struck with wonder and terror at his success. There are 54 cities on the island, all spacious and magnificent, identical in language, customs, institutions, and laws. So far as the location permits, all of them are built on the same plan, and have the same appearance. The nearest are at least 24 miles apart, and the farthest are not so remote that a person cannot go on foot from one to the other in a day. Once a year, every city sends 3 of its old and experienced citizens to Amaurot to consider affairs of common interest to the island. Amaurot lies at the navel of the island, so to speak, and is convenient to every other district, so it acts as a capital. Every city has enough ground assigned to it so that at least 12 miles of farmland are available in every direction. Though where the cities are farther apart, they have much more land. No city wants to enlarge its boundaries, for the inhabitants consider themselves good tenants rather than landlords. At proper intervals all over the countryside, they have built houses and furnished them with farm equipment. These houses are inhabited by citizens, who come to the country by turns to occupy them. No rural house has fewer than 40 men and women in it, besides 2 slaves. The master and mistress, serious and mature persons, are in charge of each household. Over every 30 households is placed a single phylarch. Each year, 20 persons from each rural household move back to the city after completing a 2-year stint in the country. In their place, 20 others are sent out from town to learn farm work from those who have already been in the country for a year and who are better skilled at farming. They, in turn, will teach those who come the following year. If all were equally unskilled in farm work and new to it, they might harm the crops out of ignorance. This custom of alternating farm workers is solemnly established so that no one will have to do such hard work unwillingly for more than 2 years. But many of them, who take a natural pleasure in farm life, are allowed to stay longer. The farm workers till the soil, feed the animals, hew wood, and take it to the city by land or by water, as is most convenient. They breed an enormous number of chickens by a marvelous method. The farmers, not hens, hatch the eggs by keeping them in a warm place at an even temperature. As soon as they come out of the shell, the chicks recognize the humans, follow them around, and are devoted to them instead of to their mothers. They raise very few horses, and these full of metal, which they keep only to exercise the young people in the art of horsemanship. For the heavy work of plowing and hauling, they use oxen, which they agree are inferior to horses over the short haul, but which can hold out longer under heavy burdens, are less subject to disease, as they suppose, and so can be kept with less cost and trouble. Moreover, when oxen are too old for work, they can be used for meat. Grain they use only to make bread. They drink wine, apple or pear cider, or simple water, which they sometimes mix with honey or licorice, of which they have an abundance. Although they know very well, down to the last detail, how much grain each city and its surrounding district will consume, they produce much more grain and cattle than they need for themselves, and share the surplus with their neighbors. Whatever goods the folk in the country need, which cannot be produced there, they request of the town magistrates, and since there is nothing to be paid or exchanged, they get what they want at once, without any haggling. They generally go to town once a month, in any case, to observe the holy days. When harvest time approaches, the phylarchs in the country notify the town magistrates how many hands will be needed. Crews of harvesters come just when they're wanted, and in 1 day of good weather they can usually get in the whole crop. Their cities, especially Amaurot. If you know one of their cities, you know them all, for they're exactly alike, except where geography itself makes a difference. So I'll describe one of them, and no matter which. But what one rather than Amaurot, the most worthy of all, since its eminence is acknowledged by the other cities which send representatives to the annual meeting there. Besides which, I know it best, because I lived there for 5 full years. Well then, Amaurot lies against a gently sloping hill. The town is almost square in shape. From a little below the crest of the hill, it runs down about 2 miles to the river Ander, and then spreads out along the river bank for a somewhat greater distance. The Ander rises from a small spring about 80 miles above Amaurot, but other streams flow into it, 2 of them being pretty big, so that, as it runs past Amaurot, the river has grown to 500 yards. It continues to grow even larger until at last, 60 miles farther along, it is lost in the ocean. In all this stretch between the sea and the city, and also for some miles above the city, the river is tidal, ebbing and flowing every 6 hours with a swift current. When the tide comes in, it fills the whole Ander with salt water for about 30 miles, driving the fresh water back. Even above that, for several miles farther, the water is brackish, but a little higher up, as it runs past the city, the water is always fresh, and when the tide ebbs, the water runs clean and sweet all the way to the sea. The 2 banks of the river at Amaurot are linked by a bridge, built not on wooden piles, but on remarkable stone arches. It is placed at the upper end of the city, farthest removed from the sea, so that ships can sail along the entire length of the city quays without obstruction. There is also another stream, not particularly large, but very gentle and pleasant, which rises out of the hill, flows down through the center of town, and into the Ander. The inhabitants have walled around the source of this river, which takes its rise a little outside the town, and joined it to the town proper, so that if they should be attacked, the enemy would not be able to cut off the stream, or divert, or poison it. Water from the stream is carried by tile piping into various sections of the lower town. Where the terrain makes this impractical, they collect rainwater in cisterns, which serve just as well. The town is surrounded by a thick, high wall, with many towers and bastions. On 3 sides it is also surrounded by a dry ditch, broad and deep and filled with thorn hedges. On its 4th side, the river itself serves as a moat. The streets are conveniently laid out for use by vehicles and for protection from the wind. Their buildings are by no means paltry. The unbroken rows of houses facing each other across the streets through the different wards make a fine sight. The streets are 20 feet wide. Behind each row of houses, at the center of every block and extending the full length of the street, there are large gardens. Every house has a door to the street and another to the garden. The doors, which are made with 2 leaves, open easily and swing shut automatically, letting anyone enter who wants to, and so there is no private property. Every 10 years, they change houses by lot. The Utopians are very fond of these gardens of theirs. They raise vines, fruits, herbs, and flowers, so well cared for and flourishing that I have never seen any gardens more productive or elegant than theirs. They keep interested in gardening, partially because they delight in it, and also because of the competition between different streets, which challenge one another to produce the best gardens. Certainly you will find nothing else in the whole city more useful or more pleasant to the citizens. And this gives reason to think that the founder of the city paid particular attention to the siting of these gardens. They say that in the beginning the whole city was planned by King Utopius himself, but that he left to posterity matters of adornment and improvement, such as could not be perfected in one man's lifetime. Their records begin 1,760 years ago, with the conquest of the island, and are carefully preserved in writing. From these records it appears that the first houses were low, like cabins or peasant huts, built out of any sort of timber, with mud-plastered walls and steep roofs, ridged and thatched with straw. But now their houses are all 3 stories high and handsomely constructed. The fronts are faced with stone, stucco, or brick, over rubble construction. The roofs are flat, and covered with a kind of plaster that is cheap but fireproof, and more weather-resistant even than lead. Glass is very generally used in windows to keep out the weather, and they also use thin linen cloth treated with oil or gum, so that it lets in more light and keeps out more wind. Once a year, every group of 30 households elects an official, formerly called the Syphogrant, but now called the Phylarch. Over every group of 10 Syphogrants, with their households, there is another official, once called the Tranibor, but now known as the head Phylarch. All the Syphogrants, 200 in number, are brought together to elect the governor. They take an oath to choose the man they think best qualified, and then by secret ballot they elect the governor from among 4 men nominated by the people of the 4 sections of the city. The governor holds office for life, unless he is suspected of aiming at a tyranny. Though the Tranibors are elected annually, they are not changed for light or casual reasons. All their other officials hold office for a single year only. The Tranibors meet to consult with the prince every other day, and more often if necessary. They discuss affairs of state and settle the occasional disputes between private parties, if there are any, and there are in any case very few, acting as quickly as possible. The Tranibors always invite 2 Syphogrants to the Senate chamber, different ones every day. There is a rule that no decision can be made on a matter of public business unless it has been discussed in the Senate on 3 separate days. It is a capital offense to make plans about public business outside of the Senate or the popular assembly. The purpose of these rules, they say, is to prevent the governor and the Tranibors from conspiring together to alter the government and enslave the people. Therefore, all matters which are considered important are first laid before the popular assembly of the Syphogrants. They talk the matter over with the households they represent, debate it with one another, then report their recommendation to the Senate. Sometimes the question is brought before the General Council of the whole island. The Senate has a standing rule never to discuss a matter on the same day when it was first introduced. All new business is deferred to the next morning. They do this so that a man will not blurt out the first thought that occurs to him, and then devote all his energies to defending those foolish impulses, instead of considering impartially the public good. They know that some men would rather jeopardize the general welfare than admit to having been heedless and short-sighted. So perverse and preposterous is their sense of pride. They should have had enough foresight at the beginning to speak with prudence rather than haste. Their occupations. Agriculture is the one occupation at which everyone works, men and women alike, with no exceptions. They are trained in it from childhood, partly in the schools, where they learn theory, and partly through field trips to nearby farms, which make something like a game of practical instruction. On these trips, they not only watch the work being done, but frequently pitch in and get a workout by doing the jobs themselves. Besides farm work, which, as I said, everyone performs, each person is taught a particular trade of his own, such as wool working, linen making, masonry, metalwork, or carpentry. There is no other craft that is practiced by any considerable number of them. Throughout the island people wear, and down through the centuries they have always worn, the same style of clothing, except for the distinction between the sexes, and between married and unmarried persons. Their clothing is attractive, does not hamper bodily movement, and serves for warm as well as cold weather. What is more, each household can make its own. Every person, and this includes women as well as men, learns a second trade besides agriculture. As the weaker sex, women practice the lighter crafts, such as working in wool or linen. The heavier jobs are assigned to the men. As a rule, the son is trained to his father's craft, for which most feel a natural inclination. But if anyone is attracted to another occupation, he is transferred by adoption into a family practicing the trade he prefers. When anyone makes such a change, both his father and the authorities make sure that he is assigned to a grave and responsible householder. After someone has learned one trade, if he wants to learn another, he gets the same permission. When he has learned both, he pursues whichever he likes better, unless the city needs one more than the other. The chief and almost only business of the Syphogrants is to manage matters so that no one sits around in idleness, and assure that everyone works hard at his trade. But no one has to exhaust himself with endless toil from early morning to late at night, as if he were a beast of burden. Such wretchedness, really worse than slavery, is the common lot of workmen almost everywhere except Utopia. Of the day's 24 hours, the Utopians devote only 6 to work. They work 3 hours before noon, when they go to lunch. After lunch, they rest for a couple of hours. Then go to work for another 3 hours. Then they have supper, and at 8 o'clock, counting the first hour after noon as 1, they go to bed and sleep 8 hours. The other hours of the day, when they are not working, eating, or sleeping, are left to each person's individual discretion, provided that free time is not wasted in roistering or sloth, but used properly in some chosen occupation. Generally, these periods are devoted to intellectual activity, for they have an established custom of giving public lectures before daybreak. Attendance at these lectures is required only of those who have been specially chosen to devote themselves to learning, but a great many other people, both men and women, choose voluntarily to attend. Depending on their interests, some go to one lecture, some to another. But if anyone would rather devote his spare time to his trade, as many do who don't care for the intellectual life, this is not discouraged. In fact, such persons are commended as especially useful to the Commonwealth. After supper, they devote an hour to recreation, in their gardens when the weather is fine, or during the winter weather in the common halls where they have their meals. There they either play music or amuse themselves with conversation. They know nothing about gambling with dice, or other such foolish and ruinous games. They do play 2 games not unlike our own chess. One is a battle of numbers, in which one number captures another. The other is a game in which the vices fight a battle against the virtues. The game is set up to show how the vices oppose one another, yet readily combine against the virtues. Then, what vices oppose what virtues, how they try to assault them openly or undermine them insidiously, how the virtues can break the strength of the vices or turn their purposes to good, and finally, by what means one side or the other gains the victory. But in all this, you may get the wrong impression if we don't go back and consider one point more carefully. Because they allot only 6 hours to work, you might think the necessities of life would be in scant supply. This is far from the case. Their working hours are ample to provide not only enough, but more than enough of the necessities and even the conveniences of life. You will easily appreciate this if you consider how large a part of the population in other countries exists without doing any work at all. In the first place, hardly any of the women, who are a full half of the population, work, or, if they do, then as a rule their husbands lie snoring in bed. Then there is a great lazy gang of priests and so-called religious. Add to them all the rich, especially the landlords, who are commonly called gentlemen and nobility. Include with them their retainers, that mob of swaggering bullies. Finally, reckon in with these sturdy and lusty beggars, who go about feigning some disease as an excuse for their idleness. You will certainly find that the things which satisfy our needs are produced by far fewer hands than you had supposed. And now consider how few of those who do work are really doing essential things. For where money is the standard of everything, many vain, superfluous trades are bound to be carried on simply to satisfy luxury and licentiousness. Suppose the multitude of those who now work were limited to a few trades, and set to producing just those conveniences and commodities that nature really requires. They would be bound to produce so much that the prices would drop, and the workmen would be unable to gain a living. But suppose again that all the workers in useless trades were put to useful ones, and that the idlers, who now guzzle twice as much as the working men who make what they consume, were assigned to productive tasks. Well, you can easily see how little time would be enough, and more than enough, to produce all the goods that human needs and conveniences require. Yes, and human pleasure too, as long as it's true and natural pleasure. The experience of Utopia makes this perfectly apparent. In each city and its surrounding countryside, barely 500 of those men and women whose age and strength make them fit for work are exempted from it. Among these are the suffragants, who by law are free not to work, yet they do not take advantage of the privilege, preferring to set a good example to their fellow citizens. Some are permanently excepted from work, so that they may devote themselves to study, but only on the recommendation of the priests and through a secret vote of the suffragants. If any of these scholars disappoints their hopes, he becomes a workman again. On the other hand, it happens from time to time that a craftsman devotes his leisure so earnestly to study, and makes such progress as a result, that he is relieved of manual labor, and promoted to the class of learned men. From this class of scholars are chosen ambassadors, priests, tranibors, and the governor himself, who used to be called Barzanes, but in their modern tongue is known as a Demas. Since all the rest of the population is neither idle nor occupied in useless trades, it is easy to see why they produce so much in so short a working day. Apart from all this, in several of the necessary crafts their way of life requires less total labor than does that of people elsewhere. In other countries, building and repairing houses requires the constant work of many men, because what a father has built, his thriftless heir lets fall to ruin, and then his successor has to repair at great expense what could easily have been maintained at a very small charge. Further, even when a man has built a splendid house at vast cost, someone else may think he has finer taste, let the first house fall to ruin, and then build another somewhere else for just as much money. But among the Utopians, where everything has been well ordered and the commonwealth properly established, building a brand new home on a new site is a rare event. They are not only quick to repair damage, but foresighted in preventing it. The result is that their buildings last for a very long time with minimal repairs, and the carpenters and masons sometimes have so little to do that they are set to hewing timber and cutting stone in case some future need for it should arise. Consider, too, how little labor their clothing requires. Their work clothes are loose garments made of leather, which last as long as 7 years. When they go out in public, they cover these rough working clothes with a cloak. Throughout the entire island, these cloaks are of the same color, which is that of natural wool. As a result, they not only need less wool than people in other countries, but what they do need is less expensive. They use linen cloth most, because it requires least labor. They like linen cloth to be white, and wool cloth to be clean, but they put no price on fineness of texture. Elsewhere, a man is not satisfied with 4 or 5 woolen cloaks of different colors and as many silk shirts, or if he's a clothes horse, even 10 of each are not enough. But a Utopian is content with a single cloak, and generally wears it for 2 years. There is no reason at all why he should want any others, for if he had them, he would not be better protected against the cold, nor would he appear in any way better dressed. When there is an abundance of everything, as a result of everyone working at useful trades and nobody consuming to excess, then a great number of people often go out to work on the roads, if any of them need repairing. And when there is no need even for this sort of public work, then the officials very often proclaim a shorter work-day, since they never force their citizens to perform useless labor. The chief aim of their constitution is that, whenever public need permits, all citizens should be free, so far as possible, to withdraw their time and energy from the service of the body and devote themselves to the freedom and culture of the mind. For in that, they think, is the real happiness of life. Social relations. Now, I must explain the social relations of these folk, the way the citizens behave towards one another, and how they distribute their goods within the society. Each city, then, consists of households, the households consisting generally of blood relations. When the women grow up and are married, they move into their husbands' households. On the other hand, male children, and after them grandchildren, remain in the family, and are subject to the oldest member, unless his mind has started to fail, in which case the next oldest takes his place. To keep the cities from becoming too large or too small, they have decreed that there shall be no more than 6,000 households in each, exclusive of the surrounding countryside, each family containing between 10 and 16 adults. They do not, of course, try to regulate the number of minor children in a family. The limit on adults is easily observed by transferring individuals from a household with too many into a household with not enough. Likewise, if a city has too many people, the extra persons serve to make up a shortage of population in other cities. And if the population throughout the entire island exceeds the quota, then they enroll citizens out of every city and plant a colony, under their own laws, on the mainland near them, wherever the natives have plenty of unoccupied and uncultivated land. Those natives who want to live with the Utopian settlers are taken in. When such a merger occurs, the two people gradually and easily blend together, sharing the same way of life and customs, much to the advantage of both. For by their policies the Utopians make the land yield an abundance for all, though previously it had seemed too barren and paltry to even support the natives. But if the natives will not join in living under their laws, the Utopians drive them out of the land they claim for themselves, and if they resist, make war on them. The Utopians say it is perfectly justifiable to make war on people who leave their land idle and waste, yet forbid the use of it to others who, by the law of nature, ought to be supported from it. If for any reason one of their cities shrinks so sharply in population that it cannot be made up from other cities without bringing them too under proper strength, then the population is restored by bringing people back from the colonies. This has happened only twice, they say, in their whole history, both times as the result of a frightful plague. They would rather that their colonies dwindled away than that any of the cities on their island should get too small. But to return to their manner of living, the oldest of every household, as I said, is the ruler. Wives are subject to their husbands, children to their parents, and generally the younger to their elders. Every city is divided into 4 equal districts, and in the middle of each district is a market for all kinds of commodities. Whatever each household produces is brought here and stored in warehouses, each kind of goods in its own place. Here the head of each household looks for what he or his family needs, and carries off what he wants without any sort of payment or compensation. Why should anything be refused him? There is plenty of everything, and no reason to fear that anyone will claim more than he needs. Why would anyone be suspect of asking for more than is needed, when everyone knows there will never be any shortage? Fear of want, no doubt, makes every living creature greedy and avaricious, and, in addition, man develops these qualities out of sheer pride, pride which glories in getting ahead of others by a superfluous display of possessions. But this kind of vice has no place whatever in the Utopian way of life. Next to the marketplace of which I just spoke are the food markets, where people bring all sorts of vegetables, fruit, and bread. Fish, meat, and poultry are also brought there from designated places outside the city, where running water can carry away all the blood and refuse. Slaves do the slaughtering and cleaning in these places. Citizens are not allowed to do such work. The Utopians feel slaughtering our fellow creatures gradually destroys the sense of compassion, which is the finest sentiment of which our human nature is capable. Besides, they don't allow anything dirty or filthy to be brought into the city, lest the air become tainted by putrefaction and thus infections. Each ward has its own spacious halls, equally distant from one another, and each known by a special name. In these halls live the Ciphogrants. 30 families are assigned to each hall to take their meals in common. 15 live on one side of the hall, 15 on the other. The stewards of each hall meet at a fixed time in the market and get food according to the number of persons for whom each is responsible. In distributing food, first consideration goes to the sick, who are cared for in public hospitals. Every city has 4 of these, built at the city limits, slightly outside the walls, and spacious enough to appear like little towns. The hospitals are large for 2 reasons, so that the sick, however numerous they may be, will not be packed closely and uncomfortably together, and also so that those who have a contagious disease, such as might pass from one to the other, may be isolated. The hospitals are well ordered and supplied with everything needed to cure the patients, who are nursed with tender and watchful care. Highly skilled physicians are in constant attendance. Consequently, though nobody is sent there against his will, there is hardly anyone in the city who would not rather be treated for an illness at the hospital than at home. When the hospital steward has received the food prescribed for the sick by their doctors, the rest is fairly divided among the halls according to the number in each, except that small regard is paid to the governor, the high priest, and the tranibors, as well as to ambassadors and foreigners, if there are any. In fact, foreigners are very few, but when they do come, they have certain furnished houses assigned to them. At the hours of lunch and supper, a brazen trumpet summons the entire Ciphogranti to assemble in their hall, except for those who are bedridden, in the hospitals or at home. After the halls have been served with their quotas of food, nothing prevents an individual from taking food home from the marketplace. They realize that no one would do this without good reason. For while it is not forbidden to eat at home, no one does it willingly, because it is not thought proper. And besides, it would be stupid to take the trouble of preparing a worse meal at home, when there is an elegant and sumptuous one near at hand in the hall. In the Ciphogrants' hall, slaves do all the particularly dirty and heavy work. But planning the meal, as well as preparing and cooking the food, is carried out by the women alone, with each family taking its turn. Depending on their number, they sit down at 3 or more tables. The men sit with their backs to the wall, the women on the outside, so that if a woman has a sudden qualm or pain, such as occasionally happens during pregnancy, she may get up without disturbing the others and go off to the nurses. A separate dining room is assigned to the nurses and infants, with a plentiful supply of cradles, clean water, and a warm fire. Thus the nurses may lay the infants down, change them, dress them, and let them play before the fire. Each child is nursed by its own mother, unless death or illness prevents. When that happens, the wife of the Ciphogrant quickly finds a suitable nurse. The problem is not difficult. Any woman who can gladly volunteers for the job, since all the Utopians applaud her kindness, and the child itself regards its new nurse as its natural mother. Children under the age of 5 sit together in the nursery. All other minors, both boys and girls up to the age of marriage, either wait on the table, or, if not old and strong enough for that, stand by in absolute silence. They eat whatever is handed to them by those sitting at the table, and have no other set time for their meals. The civigrant with his wife sits in the middle of the first table, at the highest part of the dining hall. This is the place of greatest honor, and from this table, which is placed crosswise to the other tables, the whole gathering can be seen. 2 of the eldest sit with them, for they always sit in groups of 4. If there is a church in the district, the priest and his wife sit with the civigrant and preside with him. On both sides of them sit younger people, next to them older people again, and so through the hall those of about the same age sit together, yet are mingled with others of a different age. The reason for this, as they explain it, is that the dignity of the aged and the respect due them may restrain the younger people from improper freedom of words and gestures, since nothing said or done at table can pass unnoticed by the old, who are present on every side. Dishes of food are not served down the tables in order from top to bottom, but all the old persons, who are seated in conspicuous places, are served the best food, and then equal shares are given out to the rest. The old people, as they feel inclined, give their neighbors a share of those delicacies which are not plentiful enough to be served to everyone. Thus due respect is paid to seniority, but everyone enjoys some of the benefits. They begin every lunch and supper with some reading on a moral topic, but keep it brief, lest it become a bore. Taking that as an occasion, the elders introduce topics of conversation, which they try not to make gloomy or dull. They never monopolize the conversation with long monologues, but are ready to hear what the young people say. In fact, they deliberately draw them out in order to discover the natural temper and quality of each one's mind, as revealed in the freedom of mealtime talk. Their lunches are light, their suppers rather more elaborate, because lunch is followed by work, supper by rest and a night's sleep, which they think particularly helpful to good digestion. Never a meal passes without music, and the dessert course is never scanted. During the meal, they burn incense and scatter perfume, omitting nothing which will make the occasion festive. For they are somewhat inclined to think that no kind of pleasure is forbidden, provided harm does not come of it. This is the ordinary pattern of life in the city. But in the country, where they are farther removed from neighbors, they all eat in their own homes. No family lacks for food, since, after all, whatever city dwellers eat comes originally from those in the country. The Travels of the Utopians. Any individuals who want to visit friends living in another city, or simply to see the place itself, can easily obtain permission from the civigrants and tranibors, unless for some special occasion they are needed at home. They travel together in groups, taking a letter from the governor granting leave to travel and fixing a day of return. They are given a wagon and a public slave to drive the oxen and look after them. But unless women are in the company, they usually dispense with the wagon as an unnecessary bother. Wherever they go, though they take nothing with them, they never lack for anything, because they are at home everywhere. If they stay more than a day in one place, each one practices his trade there in the shop of the local artisans, by whom he is kindly received. Anyone who takes upon himself to leave his district without permission, and is caught without the governor's letter, is treated with contempt, brought back as a runaway, and severely punished. If he is bold enough to try it a second time, he is made a slave. Anyone who wants to stroll about and explore the extent of his own district is not prevented, provided he first obtains his father's permission and his spouse's consent. But wherever he goes in the countryside, he gets no food until he has completed either a morning's or an afternoon's stint of work. On these terms, he may go where he pleases within his own district, yet be just as useful to the community as if he were at home. So you see there is no chance to loaf or kill time, no pretext for evading work, no taverns or alehouses or brothels. no chances for corruption, no hiding places, no spots for secret meetings. Because they live in the full view of all, they are bound to be either working at their usual trades or enjoying their leisure in a respectable way. Such customs must necessarily result in plenty of life's good things, and since they share everything equally, it follows that no one can ever be reduced to poverty or forced to beg. In the annual gathering at Amaurot, to which, as I said before, 3 representatives come from each city, they survey the island to find out where there are shortages and surpluses, and promptly satisfy one district's shortage with another's surplus. These are outright gifts. Those who give receive nothing in return for those to whom they give. Though they give freely to one city, they get freely from another, to which they gave nothing, and thus the whole island is like a single family. After they have accumulated enough for themselves, and this they consider to be a full 2 years' store, because next year's crop is always uncertain, then they export their surpluses to other countries. They sell abroad great quantities of grain, honey, wool, flax, timber, scarlet and purple dye-stuffs, hides, wax, tallow, and leather, as well as livestock. 1/7 of their cargo they give freely to the poor of the importing country, and the rest they sell at moderate prices. In exchange, they receive not only such goods as they lack at home. In fact, the one important thing they lack is iron, but immense quantities of silver and gold. They have been carrying on trade for a long time now, and have accumulated a greater supply of the precious metals than you would believe possible. As a result, they now care very little whether they sell for cash or credit, and most payments to them actually take the form of promissory notes. However, in all such transactions, they never trust individuals, but insist that the foreign city become officially responsible. When the day of payment comes, the city collects the money due from private debtors, puts it into the treasury, and enjoys the use of it till the Utopians claim payment. Most of it, in fact, is never claimed. The Utopians think it hardly right to take what they don't need away from people who do need it. But if they want to lend the money to some other nation, then they call it in, as they do also when they must wage war. This is the only reason that they have kept such an immense treasure at home, as a protection against extreme peril or sudden emergency. They use it above all to hire, at extravagant rates of pay, foreign mercenaries, whom they would much rather risk in battle than their own citizens. They know very well that for large enough sums of money can themselves be bought off or set at odds with one another, either secretly or openly. For this reason, therefore, they have accumulated a vast treasure, but they do not keep it like a treasure. I'm really quite ashamed to tell you how they do keep it, because you probably won't believe me. I would not have believed it myself if someone had just told me about it, but I was there and saw it with my own eyes. It is a general rule that the more different anything is from what people are used to, the harder it is to accept. But considering that all their other customs are so unlike ours, a sensible judge will perhaps not be surprised that they treat gold and silver quite differently from the way we do. After all, they never do use money among themselves, but keep it only for a contingency which may or may not actually arise. So, in the meanwhile, they take care that no one shall overvalue gold and silver, of which money is made, beyond what the metals themselves deserve. Anyone can see, for example, that iron is far superior to either. Men could not live without iron, by heaven, any more than without fire or water. But nature granted to gold and silver no function with which we cannot easily dispense. Human folly has made them precious, because they are rare. Like a most wise and generous mother, nature has placed the best things out in the open, like air, water, and the earth itself. But she has hidden away in remote places all vain and unprofitable things. If in Utopia gold and silver were kept locked up in some tower, foolish heads among the common people might well concoct a story that the governor and the senate were out to cheat the ordinary folk and get some advantage for themselves. They might indeed put the gold and silver into beautiful plateware and rich handwork, but then, in case of necessity, the people would not want to give up such articles, on which they had begun to fix their hearts, only to melt them down for soldiers' pay. To avoid all these inconveniences, they thought of a plan which conforms with their institutions as clearly as it contrasts with our own. Unless one has actually seen it working, their plan may seem incredible, because we prize gold so highly and are so careful about protecting it. With them, it's just the other way. While they eat from pottery dishes and drink from glass cups, well made but inexpensive, their chamber pots and all their humblest vessels, for use in the common halls and even in private homes, are made of gold and silver. The chains and heavy fetters of slaves are also made of these metals. Finally, criminals who are to bear through life the mark of some disgraceful act are forced to wear golden rings on their ears, golden bands on their fingers, golden chains around their necks, and even golden crowns on their heads. Thus they hold gold and silver up to scorn in every conceivable way. As a result, when they have to part with these metals, which other nations give up with as much agony as if they were being disemboweled, the Utopians feel it no more than the loss of a penny. They pick up pearls by the seashore, diamonds and garnets in certain cliffs, but never go out of set purpose to look for them. If they happen to find some, they polish them, and give them to the children, who, when they are small, feel proud and pleased with such gaudy decorations. But after, when they grow a bit older, and notice that only babies like such toys, they lay them aside. Their parents don't have to say anything. The children simply put these trifles away out of a shamefaced sense that they are no longer suitable, just as our children, when they grow up, put away their rattles, marbles, and dolls. Different customs, different feelings. I never saw the adage better illustrated than in the case of the Amaurot ambassadors, who came to Amaurot while I was there. Because they came to discuss important business, the Senate had assembled ahead of time, 3 citizens from each city. The ambassadors from nearby nations, who had visited Utopia before and knew something of their customs, realized that fine clothes were not much respected in the land. Silk was despised, and gold was a badge of contempt, and therefore they came in the very plainest of their clothes. But the Amaurotans, who lived farther off and had fewer dealings with the Utopians, had heard only that they all dressed alike and very simply, so they took for granted that their hosts had nothing to wear that they didn't put on. Being themselves rather more proud than wise, they decided to dress as resplendently as the very gods, and dazzle the eyes of the poor Utopians by the glitter of their garb. Consequently, the 3 ambassadors made a grand entry with a suite of 100 attendants, all in clothing of many colors, and most in silk. Being noblemen at home, the ambassadors were arrayed in cloth of gold, with heavy gold chains on their necks, gold rings on their ears and fingers, and sparkling strings of pearls and gems on their caps. In fact, they were decked out in all the articles which in Utopia are used to punish slaves, shame wrongdoers, or pacify infants. It was a sight to see how they strutted when they compared their finery with the dress of the Utopians, who had poured out into the street to see them pass. But it was just as funny to see how wide they fell of the mark, and how far they were from getting the consideration they wanted and expected. Except for a very few Utopians who for some special reason had visited foreign countries, all the onlookers considered this pomp and splendor a mark of disgrace. They therefore bowed to the humblest servants as lords, and took the ambassadors, because of their golden chains, to be slaves, passing them by without any reverence at all. You might have seen children, who had themselves thrown away their pearls and gems, nudge their mothers when they saw the ambassadors' jeweled caps, and say, "Look at that big lummox, mother, who's still wearing pearls and jewels as if he were a little boy." But the mother, in all seriousness, would answer, "Hush, son, I think he's one of the ambassador's fools." Others found fault with the golden chains as useless, because they were so flimsy any slave could break them, and so loose that he could easily shake them off and run away whenever he wanted. But after the ambassadors had spent a couple of days among the Utopians, they learned of the immense amounts of gold which were as thoroughly despised there as they were prized at home. They saw, too, that more gold and silver went into making the chains and fetters of a single runaway slave than into costuming all three of them. Somewhat crestfallen, then, they put away all the finery in which they had strutted so arrogantly. But they saw the wisdom of doing so after they had talked with the Utopians enough to learn their customs and opinions. They marvel that any mortal can take pleasure in the weak sparkle of a little gem or bright pebble, when he has a star or the sun itself to look at. They are amazed at the foolishness of any man who considers himself a nobler fellow because he wears clothing of especially fine wool. No matter how delicate the thread, they said, a sheep wore it once, and still was nothing but a sheep. They are surprised that gold, a useless commodity in itself, is everywhere valued so highly that man himself, who for his own purposes conferred this value on it, is far less valuable. They do not understand why a dunderhead, with no more brains than a post, and who is as depraved as he is foolish, should command a great many wise and good people simply because he happens to have a great pile of gold. Yet, if this booby should lose his money to the lowest rascal in his household, as can happen by chance, or through some legal trick, for the law can produce reversals as violent as luck itself, he would promptly become one of the fellow's scullions, as if he were personally attached to the coin, and a mere appendage of it. Even more than this, the Utopians are appalled at those people who practically worship a rich man, though they neither owe him anything nor are obligated to him in any way. What impresses them is simply that the man is rich. Yet all the while they know he is so mean and grasping that as long as he lives not a single penny out of that great mound of money will ever come their way. These and the like attitudes of the Utopians have picked up partly from their upbringing, since the institutions of their society are completely opposed to such folly, and partly from instructions and their reading of good books. For though not many people in each city are excused from labor and assigned to scholarship full time, these are persons who from childhood have given evidence of unusual intelligence and devotion to learning. Every child gets an introduction to good literature, and throughout their lives a large part of people, men and women alike, spend their leisure time in reading. They can study all the branches of learning in their native tongue, which is not deficient in terminology or unpleasant in sound, and adapts itself fluently to the expression of thought. Just about the same language is spoken throughout that entire area of the world, though elsewhere it is somewhat more corrupt, depending on the district. Before we came there, the Utopians had never so much as heard about a single one of those philosophers whose names are so celebrated in our part of the world. Yet in music, dialectic, arithmetic, and geometry, they have found out just about the same things as our great men of the past. But while they equal the ancients in almost all other subjects, they are far from matching the inventions of our modern logicians. In fact, they have not discovered even one of those elaborate rules about restrictions, amplifications, and suppositions which our own schoolboys study in the little logic book. They are so far from being able to speculate on second intentions that not one of them was able to conceive of a man in general, though I pointed straight at him with my finger, and he is, as you well know, bigger than any giant, maybe even a colossus. On the other hand, they have learned to plot expertly the courses of the stars and the movements of the heavenly bodies. They have devised a number of different instruments, by which they compute with the greatest exactness the course of the sun, the moon, and the other stars that are visible in their area of the sky. As for the friendly and hostile influences of the planets, and that whole deceitful business of divination by the stars, they have never so much as dreamed of it. From long experience and observation, they are able to forecast rains, winds, and other changes in the weather. But as to the causes of the weather, of the flow of the sea and its saltiness, and the origins and nature of the heavens and the universe, they have varied opinions. They agree with our ancient philosophers on some matters, but on others, just as the ancient disagreed with one another, so the Utopians differ from all the ancients, and yet reach no consensus among themselves. In matters of moral philosophy, They carry on much the same arguments as we do. They inquire into the nature of the good, distinguishing goods of the body from goods of the mind and external goods. They ask whether the name of good may be applied to all three, or applies to only goods of the mind. They discuss virtue and pleasure, but their chief concern is what to think of human happiness, and whether it consists of one thing or of more. They seem overly inclined to the view of those who think that all or most human happiness consists of pleasure. And what is more surprising, they seek support for this comfortable opinion from their religion, which is serious and strict, indeed, almost stern and forbidding. For they never discuss happiness without joining to their philosophic rationalism certain principles drawn from religion. Without these religious principles, they think that reason by itself is weak and defective in its efforts to investigate true happiness. Their religious principles are of this nature: that the soul of man is immortal, and by God's goodness born for happiness; that after this life, rewards are appointed for our virtues and good deeds, punishments for our sins. Though these are indeed religious beliefs, they think that reason leads men to believe and accept them. And they add unhesitatingly that if these beliefs were rejected, no one would be so stupid as to not feel that he should seek pleasure, regardless of right and wrong. His only care would be to keep a lesser pleasure from standing in the way of a greater one, and to avoid pleasures that are inevitably followed by pain. They think you would have to be actually crazy to pursue harsh and painful virtue, give up the pleasures of life, and suffer pain from which you can expect no advantage. For if there is no reward after death, you have no compensation for having passed your entire existence without pleasure, that is, miserably. To be sure, they believe happiness is found, not in every kind of pleasure, but only in good and honest pleasure. Virtue itself, they say, draws out our nature to this kind of pleasure, as to the supreme good. There is an opposed school which declares that virtue itself is happiness. They define virtue as living according to nature, and God, they say, created us to that end. When an individual obeys the dictates of reason in choosing one thing and avoiding another, he is following nature. Now the first rule of reason is to love and venerate the divine majesty to whom we owe our existence and every happiness of which we are capable. The second rule of nature is to lead a life as free of anxiety and as full of joy as possible, and to help all one's fellow men toward that end. The most hard-faced eulogist of virtue, and the grimmest enemy of pleasure, while they invite us to toil, and sleepless nights, and self-laceration, still admonish us to relieve the poverty and misfortune of others as best we can. It is especially praiseworthy, they tell us, when we provide for our fellow creatures comfort and welfare. Nothing is more humane, and humanity is the virtue most proper to human beings, than to relieve the misery of others, assuage their griefs, and, by removing all sadness from their lives, to restore them to enjoyment, that is, pleasure. Well, if this is the case, why doesn't nature equally invite us to do the same for ourselves? Either a joyful life, that is, one of pleasure, is a good thing, or it isn't. If it isn't, then you should not help anyone to it. Indeed, you ought to take it away from everyone you can, as harmful and deadly to them. But if such a life is good, and if we are supposed, indeed obliged, to help others to it, why shouldn't we first of all seek it for ourselves, to whom we owe no less charity than to anyone else? When nature prompts us to be kind to our neighbors, she does not mean that we should be cruel and merciless to ourselves. Thus, they say that nature herself prescribes for us a joyous life, in other words, pleasure, as the goal of our actions, and living accordingly to her prescriptions is to be defined as virtue. And as nature bids mortals to make one another's lives merrier, to the extent that they can, so she warns us constantly not to seek our own advantages so avidly that we cause misfortune to our fellows. And the reason for this is an excellent one, for no one is placed so far above the rest that he is nature's sole concern. She cherishes alike all those living beings to whom she has granted the same form. Consequently, The Utopians maintain that one should not only abide by private agreements, but also obey all those public laws which control the distribution of vital goods, such as are the very substance of pleasure. Any such laws, provided they have been properly promulgated by a good king, or ratified by a people free of force and fraud, should be observed. And as long as they are observed, to pursue your own interests is prudent. To pursue the public interest as well is pious. But to pursue your own pleasure by depriving others of theirs is unjust. On the other hand, deliberately to decrease one's own pleasure in order to augment that of others is a work of humanity and benevolence which never fails to benefit the doer, more even than he benefits others. You may be repaid for your kindness, and in any case you are conscious of having done a good deed. Your mind draws more joy from recalling the gratitude and good will of those whom you have benefited than your body would have drawn pleasure from the things you gave away. Finally, they believe, as religion easily persuades a well-disposed mind to believe, that God will recompense us for surrendering a brief and transitory pleasure, with immense and never-ending joy in heaven. And so they conclude, after careful consideration and weighing the matter, that all our actions and virtues exercised within them look toward pleasure and happiness as their ultimate end. By pleasure, they understand every state or moment of body or mind in which we naturally find delight. They are right in considering our appetites natural. By simply following our senses and right reason, we may discover what is pleasant by nature. It is a delight that does not injure others, that does not preclude a greater pleasure, and that is not followed by pain, but a pleasure which is against nature, which men call delightful only by the emptiest of fictions, as if one could change the real nature of things just by changing their names, does not really make for happiness. In fact, they say, it destroys happiness, and the reason is that men whose minds are filled with false ideas of pleasure have no room left for true and genuine delight. As a matter of fact, there are a great many things which have no sweetness in them, but are mainly or entirely bitter, yet which through the perverse enticements of evil lusts are considered very great pleasures, and even the supreme goals of life. Among the devotees of this false pleasure, they include those whom I mentioned before, the people who think themselves finer fellows because they wear finer clothes. These people are twice mistaken, first in thinking their clothes better than anyone else's, and then in thinking themselves better because of their clothes. As far as a coat's usefulness goes, what does it matter if it was woven of thin thread or thick? Yet they act as if they were set apart by nature herself, rather than their own fantasies. They strut about and put on airs. Because they have a fancy suit, they think themselves entitled to honors they would never have expected if they were dressed in homespun, and they grow indignant if someone passes them by without showing special respect. It is the same kind of absurdity to be pleased by empty, ceremonial honors. What true and natural pleasure can you get from someone's bent knee or bared head? Will the creaks in your own knees be eased thereby, or the madness in your head? The phantom of false pleasure is illustrated by others, who run mad with delight over their own blue blood, plume themselves on their nobility, and applaud themselves for all their rich ancestors, the only ancestors that count nowadays, and all their ancient family estates. Even if they don't have the shred of an estate themselves, or if they've squandered every penny of their inheritance, they don't consider themselves a bit less noble. In the same class they put those people I described before, who are mad for jewelry and gems, and think themselves divinely happy if they find a good specimen, especially of the sort that happens to be fashionable in their country at the time. For stones vary in value from one market to another. The collector will not make an offer for the stone till it's taken out of its setting, and even then he will not buy unless the dealer guarantees and gives security that it is a true and genuine stone. What he fears is that his eyes will be deceived by a counterfeit. But if you consider the matter, why should a counterfeit give any less pleasure, when your eyes cannot distinguish it from a real gem? Both should be of equal value to you, as they would be, in fact, to a blind man. What about those who pile up money not because they want to do anything with the heap, but so they can sit and look at it? Is that true pleasure they experience? Or aren't they simply cheated by a show of pleasure? Or what of those with the opposite vice, who hide away money they will never use, and perhaps never even see again? In their anxiety to hold on to their money, they actually lose it. For what else happens when you deprive yourself, and perhaps other people too, of a chance to use money by burying it in the ground? And yet when the miser has hidden his treasure, he exults over it as if his mind were now free to rejoice. Suppose someone stole it, and the miser died 10 years later, knowing nothing of the theft. During all those 10 years, what did it matter whether the money was stolen or not? In either case, it was equally useless to the owner. To these false and foolish pleasures they add gambling, which they have heard about, though they've never tried it, as well as hunting and hawking. What pleasure can there be, they wonder, in throwing dice on a table? If there were any pleasure in the action, wouldn't doing it over and over again quickly make one tired of it? What pleasure can there be in listening to the barking and yelping of dogs? Isn't that rather a disgusting noise? Is there more real pleasure when a dog chases a rabbit than there is when a dog chases a dog? If what you like is fast running, there's plenty of that in both cases. They're just about the same. But if what you really want is slaughter, if you want to see a living creature torn apart under your eyes, then the whole thing is wrong. You ought to feel nothing but pity when you see the hare fleeing from the hound, the weak creature tormented by the stronger, the fearful and timid beast brutalized by the savage one, the harmless hare killed by the cruel dog. The Utopians, who regard this whole activity of hunting as unworthy of free men, have assigned it, accordingly, to their butchers, who, as I said before, are all slaves. In their eyes, hunting is the lowest thing even butchers can do. In the slaughterhouse, their work is more useful and honest, since they kill animals only from necessity, but hunters seek merely their own pleasure from the killing and mutilating of some poor little creature, taking such relish in the sight of death, even if only of beasts, reveals, in their opinion, a cruel disposition. Or if he isn't cruel to start with, the hunter quickly becomes so through the constant practice of such brutal pleasures. Common opinion considers these activities, and countless others like them, to be pleasure. But the Utopians say flatly they have nothing at all to do with real pleasure, since there's nothing naturally pleasant about them. They often please the senses, and in this sense they are like pleasure, but that does not alter their basic nature. The enjoyment does not arise from the experience itself, but only from the perverse habits of the mob, as a result of which they mistake the bitter for the sweet, just as pregnant women, whose taste has been turned awry, sometimes think pitch and tallow taste sweeter than honey. A person's taste may be similarly depraved by disease or by custom, but that does not change the nature of pleasure or anything else. They distinguish several classes of true pleasure, some being pleasures of the mind and others pleasures of the body. Those of the mind are knowledge, and the delight which rises from contemplating truth, also the gratification of looking back on a well-spent life and the unquestioning hope of happiness to come. Pleasures of the body they also divide into two classes. The first is that which fills the senses with immediate delight. Sometimes this happens when organs that have been weakened by natural heat are restored with food and drink. Sometimes it happens when we eliminate some excess in the body, as when we move our bowels, generate children, or relieve an itch somewhere by rubbing or scratching it. Now and then pleasure arises, not from restoring a deficiency or discharging an excess, but from something that excites our senses with a hidden but unmistakable force, and attracts them to itself. Such is the power of music. The second kind of bodily pleasure they describe as nothing but the calm and harmonious state of the body, its state of health when undisturbed by any disorder. Health itself, when not oppressed by pain, gives pleasure, without any external excitement at all. Even though it appeals less directly to the senses than the gross gratifications of eating and drinking, many consider this to be the greatest pleasure of all. Most of the Utopians regard this as the foundation of all other pleasures, since by itself alone it can make life peaceful and desirable, whereas without it there is no possibility of any other pleasure. Mere absence of pain, without positive health, they regard as insensibility, not pleasure. Some have maintained that a stable and tranquil state of health is not really a pleasure, on the grounds that the presence of health cannot be felt except through some external stimulus. The Utopians, who have considered the matter thoroughly, long ago rejected this opinion. On the contrary, they nearly all agree that health is the greatest of bodily pleasures. Since pain is inherent to disease, they argue, and pain is the bitter enemy of pleasure, while disease is the enemy of health, then pleasure must be inherent in quiet, good health. You may say pain is not the disease itself, simply an accompanying effect, but they argue that that makes no difference, for whether health is itself a pleasure, or is merely the cause of pleasure, as fire is the cause of heat, the fact remains that those who have stable health must also have pleasure. When we eat, they say, what happens is that health, which was starting to fade, takes food as its ally in the fight against hunger. When our health gains strength, the simple process of returning vigor gives us pleasure and refreshment. If our health feels delight in the struggle, will it not rejoice when the victory has been won? When at last it is restored to its original strength, which was its aim all through the conflict, will it at once become insensible and fail to recognize and embrace its own good? The idea that health cannot be felt they consider completely wrong. Every man who's awake, they say, feels that he's in good health, unless he isn't. Is anyone so torpid and dull that he won't admit health is delightfully agreeable to him? And what is delight except pleasure under another name? Of all the different pleasures, they seek primarily those of the mind, and prize them most highly. The foremost mental pleasures, they believe, arise from the practice of the virtues and the consciousness of a good life. Among the pleasures of the body, they give the first place to health. As for eating and drinking, and other delights of the same sort, they consider these bodily pleasures desirable, but only for the sake of health. They are not pleasant in themselves, but only as ways to withstand the insidious attacks of sickness. A wise man would rather escape sickness altogether than have a good cure for it. He would rather prevent pain than find a palliative for it. And so it would be better not to need this kind of pleasure at all than to be assuaged by it. Anyone who thinks that happiness consists of this sort of pleasure must confess that his life would be one spent in an endless round of hunger, thirst, and itching, followed by eating, drinking, scratching, and rubbing. Who fails to see that such an existence is not only disgusting, but miserable? These pleasures are certainly the lowest of all, as they are the most adulterate, for they never occur except in connection with the pains that are their contraries. Hunger, for example, is linked to the pleasure of eating, and far from equally, since the pain is sharper and lasts longer. It precedes the pleasure, and ends only when the pleasure ends with it. So they think pleasures of this sort should not be much valued, except as they are necessary to life. Yet they enjoy these pleasures too, and acknowledge gratefully the kindness of Mother Nature, who coaxes her children with allurements and cajolery to do what from hard necessity they must always do. How wretched life would be if the daily diseases of hunger and thirst had to be overcome by bitter potions and drugs, like some other diseases that afflict us less often. Beauty, strength, and agility, as special and pleasant gifts of nature, they joyfully accept. The pleasures of sound, sight, and smell they also accept as the special seasonings of life, recognizing that nature intended these delights to be the particular province of man. No other kind of animal contemplates the shape and loveliness of the universe, or enjoys odors, except in the way of searching for food, or distinguishes harmonious from dissonant sounds. But in all their pleasures, the Utopians observe this rule, that the lesser pleasure must not interfere with the greater, and that no pleasure shall carry pain with it as a consequence. If a pleasure is false, they think it will inevitably lead to pain. Moreover, they think it is crazy for a man to despise beauty of form, to impair his own strength, to grind his energy down to lethargy, to exhaust his body with fasts, to ruin his health, and to scorn natural delights, unless by doing so he can better serve the welfare of others or the public good. Then indeed he may expect a greater reward from God. But otherwise such a man does no one any good. He gains, perhaps, the empty and shadowy reputation of virtue, and no doubt he hardens himself against fantastic adversities which may never occur. But such a person the Utopians consider absolutely crazy, cruel to himself, as well as most ungrateful to nature, as if, to avoid being in her debt, he were to reject all her gifts. This is the way they think about virtue and pleasure. Human reason, they think, can attain no surer conclusions than these, unless a revelation from heaven should inspire men with holier notions. In all this, I have no time now to consider whether they are right or wrong, and don't feel obliged to do so. I have undertaken only to describe their principles, not to defend them. But of this I am sure, that whatever you think of their ideas, there is not a happier people or a better commonwealth anywhere in the world. In body they are active and lively, and stronger than you would expect from their stature, though they are by no means tiny. Their soil is not very fertile, nor their climate of the best, but they protect themselves against weather by temperate living, and improve their soil by industry, so that nowhere do grain and cattle flourish more plentifully, nowhere are people more vigorous, and liable to fewer diseases. There you cannot only observe that they do all the things that farmers usually do to improve poor soil by hard work and technical knowledge, but you can see a forest which they tore up by the roots with their own hands and moved to another site. They did this not so much for the sake of better growth, but to make transportation easier, in order to have wood closer to the sea, the rivers, or the cities themselves. For grain is easier than wood to transport over a long distance, especially by land. The people in general are easy-going, cheerful, clever, and fond of leisure. When they must, they can stand heavy labor, but otherwise they are not much given to it. In intellectual pursuits they are tireless. When they heard from us about the literature and learning of the Greeks, for we thought there was nothing in Latin, except the historians and poets, that they would enjoy, it was wonderful to behold how eagerly they sought to be instructed in Greek. We therefore began to study a little of it with them, at first more to avoid seeming lazy than out of any expectation that they would profit by it. But after a short trial, their diligence convinced us that our efforts would not be wasted. They picked up the forms of the letters so easily, pronounced the language so aptly, memorized it so quickly, and began to recite it so accurately that it seemed like a miracle. Most of our pupils were established scholars, of course, picked for their unusual ability and mature minds, and they studied with us, not just of their own free will, but at the command of the Senate. Thus, in less than 3 years, they had perfect control of the language, and could read the best Greek authors fluently, unless the text was corrupt. I suspect they picked up Greek more easily because it was somewhat related to their own tongue. Though their language resembles the Persian in most respects, I suspect them of deriving from Greece because their language retains quite a few vestiges of Greek in the names of cities and in official titles. Before leaving on the 4th voyage, I placed on board, instead of merchandise, a good-sized packet of books, for I had resolved not to return at all than to come back home so soon. Thus they received from me most of Plato's works and many of Aristotle's, as well as Theophrastus's book on plants, though the latter, I'm sorry to say, was somewhat mutilated. During the voyage I left it lying around. A monkey got a hold of it, and out of sheer mischief ripped out a few pages here and there. Of the grammarians they have only Lacharis, for I did not take Theodorus with me, nor any dictionary except that of his Psychus, and they have Discordies. They are very fond of Plutarch's writings, and delighted with the witty persiflage of Lucian. Among the poets, they have Aristophanes, Homer, and Euripides, together with Sophocles in the small Aldine edition. Of the historians they possess Thucydides and Herodontus, as well as Herodian. As for medical books, a comrade of mine, named Trisus Apinatus, brought with him some small treatises by Hippocrates, and the Microtechny of Galen. They were delighted to have these books because they consider medicine one of the finest and most useful parts of knowledge, even though there's hardly a country in the world that needs doctors less. They think that when they thus explore the secrets of nature, they are gratifying not only themselves, but the author and maker of nature. They suppose that, like other artists, he created this visible mechanism of the world to be admired, and by whom, if not by man, who is alone in being able to appreciate such an intricate object. Therefore he is bound to prefer a careful observer and a sensitive admirer of his work before one who, like a brute beast, looks on the grand spectacle with a stupid and blockish mind. Once stimulated by learning, the minds of the Utopians are wonderfully quick to seek out those various arts which make life more agreeable and convenient. Two inventions, to be sure, they owe to us, the art of printing and the manufacture of paper. At least, they owe these arts partly to us, though partly to their own ingenuity. While we were showing them the Aldine editions of the various books, we talked about paper-making and type-cutting, though without going into detail, for none of us had any practical experience of either skill. But with great sharpness of mind they immediately grasped basic principles. While previously they had written on vellum, bark, and papyrus, they now undertook to make paper and to print letters. Their first attempts were not altogether successful, but with practice they soon mastered both arts. If they had texts of the Greek authors, they would soon have no lack of volumes. But as they have no more than those I mentioned, they have contented themselves with reprinting each in thousands of copies. Any sightseer coming to their land who has some special intellectual gift, or who has traveled widely and seen many countries, is sure of a warm welcome, for they love to hear what is happening throughout the world. This is why we were received so kindly. Few merchants, however, go there to trade. What could they import except iron, or else gold and silver, which everyone would rather bring home than send abroad? As for their own export trade, the Utopians prefer to do their own transportation, rather than invite strangers to do it. By carrying their own cargoes, they are able to learn more about their neighbors, and keep up their skills of navigation. And I think we will stop there for today, because I think my neighbor might be gearing up for a rave by the sound of it. Next time, we will finish learning about the Utopians and their society. But until then, you can follow me on any of these social medias, including over on Patreon. Patrons get videos a week early, as well as extra bonuses. This has been Classical Titerature. Thanks for watching.